Hello, fellow explorer. I'm glad you found your way here. Welcome to Midnight Explorations, a quiet place for gentle journeys and deep rest. Tonight, we will travel along the world's greatest river, the Amazon, that vast network of waterways flowing through the heart of South America, carrying more water than any other river system on Earth. For the next little while, there's nothing for you to do and nowhere for you to go. Let the day fade into the distance and focus on getting comfortable and breathing deeply. We're going to follow those who ventured into the Amazon basin, traveling upstream from the Atlantic through countless channels and tributaries, discovering layer by layer what has always been known to those who call the forest home. Let yourself settle in as we trace these journeys through time and water, from ancient migrations to modern expeditions, learning how outsiders gradually came to understand what indigenous peoples had known for millennia. The Amazon we'll explore tonight is not empty wilderness, though it long seemed so to Europeans who first encountered it. For thousands of years before any European ship approached its mouth, the river and its tributaries supported complex human societies. Villages lined the banks, canoes moved goods along trade routes, and people shaped the forest through cultivation, managed burning, and selective planting. The story of Amazonian exploration is not about discovering an unknown land, but about the meeting of different knowledge systems, about outsiders slowly learning what residents already understood, and about the complex, often painful history of contact between worlds. Before we begin our journey upriver, it helps to understand what makes the Amazon extraordinary. The scale is difficult to grasp. The main channel stretches roughly 6,400 kilometers from its sources in the Peruvian Andes to its mouth on the Atlantic coast of Brazil. But the Amazon is not a single river. It is a basin, a vast watershed draining an area of about 7 million square kilometers, roughly 40% of South America. More than 1,000 major tributaries feed into the system, some of them among the world's largest rivers in their own right. The Negro, the Madeira, the Tapajos. Each of these could be a great river on another continent, yet here they are tributaries, merging their waters with the even greater flow of the main Amazon. The river's discharge into the Atlantic is staggering. The Amazon carries more water than the next 7 largest rivers combined, releasing roughly 200,000 cubic meters per second into the ocean during average flow, and far more during flood season. This immense volume of fresh water extends so far into the Atlantic that sailors approaching the coast encounter drinkable water while still out of sight of land, a phenomenon that astonished early European explorers accustomed to the salt sea. The Amazon is also a river of 2 colors, or rather many colors depending on which tributary you travel. Whitewater rivers like the main Amazon and the Madeira carry heavy loads of sediment eroded from the Andes, giving them a milky brown or tan appearance. Blackwater rivers like the Negro are stained dark by tannins from decomposing vegetation. Their water's clear but tea-colored, acidic and low in nutrients. Clear water rivers like the Tapajos are transparent blue or green, draining ancient geological formations that contribute little sediment. Where these different waters meet, they often flow side by side for kilometers before mixing, creating visible boundaries between water masses that behave almost as separate rivers within the same channel. The forest itself is equally varied. Floodplain forests, called varzea, along whitewater rivers, and igapo along blackwater rivers, are inundated seasonally as water levels rise by 10 meters or more. These forests are adapted to flooding. Trees with buttress roots and seeds that float. Animals that time their breeding to the flood cycle. fish that swim through the forest canopy when the water is high. Terra, firm forests, on higher ground that never floods, support different communities of plants and animals, and there are countless transitional zones, each with its own ecological character. Into this vast, complex landscape, people have moved for thousands of years. Archaeological evidence reveals that humans reached the Amazon basin at least 12,000 years ago, perhaps earlier. Over millennia, these populations developed sophisticated relationships with the forest and river. They domesticated crops including manioc, which would become a staple food throughout tropical America. They created soil enrichment techniques, building up deep deposits of dark, fertile earth, terra preta, through combinations of charcoal, organic waste, and probably deliberate composting. They shaped the forest composition, encouraging useful species and creating what were essentially managed landscapes rather than pristine wilderness. Evidence of this deep history can be found throughout the basin. In the upper Xingu region of Brazil, satellite imagery and ground surveys have revealed geometric earthworks, circles, squares, and complex patterns of raised embankments and ditches covering areas of hundreds of hectares. These structures, largely obscured by forest regrowth after abandonment, suggest organized societies capable of mobilizing labor for large-scale construction projects. Similar features have been found in Acre and in Várzea regions along the main Amazon channel. The scale of pre-Columbian Amazonian societies remained unrecognized for centuries, in part because forest regrowth obscured earthworks and because European assumptions about tropical forests as barriers to complex societies were difficult to dislodge. But from the late 20th century into the 21st, a revolution in understanding has occurred, driven by new archaeological methods and changing interpretive frameworks. The breakthrough came through multiple converging lines of evidence. Ground surveys in deforested areas of the Amazon, particularly in the Bolivian and Brazilian Amazon, revealed geometric earthworks, ditches and embankments forming precise squares, circles, and complex patterns that were invisible under forest cover, but starkly visible once vegetation was cleared. These geoglyphs, some covering areas of dozens of hectares, clearly required coordinated labor and engineering knowledge. LiDAR technology, aerial laser scanning that penetrates forest canopy to map ground surface, revealed similar features still hidden under intact forest. Surveys using LiDAR in the upper Amazon have identified thousands of previously unknown earthworks, showing that they were not isolated curiosities, but part of a widespread pattern of landscape modification. Combined with evidence of raised agricultural fields, fish weirs, causeways, and the extensive terra preta deposits, a picture emerged of densely populated regions supporting agricultural societies far more complex than previously assumed. This archaeological revolution has fundamentally revised understanding of pre-Columbian Amazonia. Rather than pristine wilderness lightly touched by small, scattered populations, large areas of the Amazon were apparently managed landscapes supporting substantial populations. Estimates now suggest several million people lived in the basin before European contact. These societies modified their environment through forest management, soil enrichment, earthwork construction, and hydrological engineering, creating anthropogenic landscapes that persisted even after population collapse from disease and colonial violence. The implications extend beyond history to ecology and conservation. The Amazon is not and never was an untouched Eden. It is a landscape co-created by humans and forest over millennia, and understanding its ecology requires acknowledging this deep history of human presence and influence. This recognition changes debates about conservation. If Amazonian biodiversity developed partly in response to indigenous management, then conservation that excludes people may be misguided, and support for indigenous territorial rights becomes not just a matter of justice, but of ecological stewardship. The purpose of these earthworks remains debated. Some may have been defensive, others ceremonial or residential. Many are precisely oriented to astronomical phenomena, suggesting they played roles in calendrical or ritual practices. What is clear is that they represent engineering on a scale that contradicts earlier assumptions about Amazonian societies being small and simple. These were complex cultures with social organization, technical knowledge, and connections to the landscape that went far beyond subsistence. The rivers themselves were highways, and indigenous navigation knowledge was profound. Boatmen learned to read current patterns, to recognize seasonal changes in water level and flow, to know which channels remained passable during low water and which became navigable only during floods. They learned the locations of hazards, submerged logs, shifting sandbars, rocky rapids, and the locations of resources, fishing grounds, nesting beaches for turtles, stands of useful palms or Brazil nut trees. This knowledge was encoded in names, in stories, in the accumulated experience passed from generation to generation. For many Amazonian peoples, the river is not merely a physical feature, but a living entity, an ancestor or a path of ancestors. Specific bends, confluences, and rapids are associated with mythic events, battles between culture heroes and monsters, transformations of beings into landscape features, journeys of the first people. To travel the river is to move through a storied landscape where every feature has meaning and history. Night travel, in particular, requires both technical skill and spiritual awareness, for darkness brings different perspectives and different presences. These deep indigenous histories form the foundation for any account of Amazonian exploration. When European ships first approached the river's mouth in the early 16th century, they were not discovering unknown territory, but entering a region already densely populated, already understood and named, already integrated into human life and culture. What followed was not exploration in the sense of revealing the unknown, but rather an encounter between peoples with vastly different understandings of what the river and forest meant. The first recorded European encounter with the Amazon came in 1500, when Vicente Yáñez Pinzón, who had been a captain on Columbus's first voyage, sailed along the Brazilian coast. His ships found fresh water far from any visible shore, puzzling the crew until they realized they had encountered the discharge of an immense river. They entered the mouth and sailed upstream for some distance, experiencing the river's power firsthand, the strong currents, the shifting channels, the vast expanse of water. Pinzón's expedition did not venture far inland. They had no maps, no knowledge of what lay upriver, and no immediate incentive to explore a region that seemed to offer neither gold nor obvious trade goods. They recorded their observations and continued along the coast, leaving the great river largely uninvestigated from a European perspective. For nearly 40 years after Pinzón, the Amazon remained peripheral to European interests in the Americas, which focused on the Caribbean, Mexico, and the rich silver deposits being discovered in Peru. The first European navigation of the Amazon's full length happened almost by accident, emerging from the chaos of Spanish conquest in South America. In 1541, Gonzalo Pizarro, brother of Francisco Pizarro, who had conquered the Inca Empire, organized an expedition from Quito to search for El Dorado and for cinnamon forests rumored to lie east of the Andes. The expedition was a disaster from the start. Thousands of indigenous porters and hundreds of Spanish soldiers and enslaved Africans struggled through mountain passes and into the rainforest, where supplies ran low and the promised riches failed to materialize. Desperate for food, Pizarro sent a smaller party under Francisco de Orellana to scout ahead by river, hoping they could locate provisions and return. Orellana's group built a small brigantine, the San Pedro, and set off down the Napo River with about 50 men. But the current was stronger than they anticipated, and supplies were scarce. After several days, Orellana faced a choice: attempt to fight back upstream against the current, likely starving in the process, or continue downstream in hopes of eventually finding help. He chose to continue, a decision that Pizarro later condemned as mutiny and abandonment. Orellana's defense was necessity. Returning upstream was impossible with their limited supplies and exhausted men. Whatever the ethics of the choice, the result was the first recorded European navigation of the Amazon's length. From the Napo, Orellana's brigantine and accompanying canoes swept into the main Amazon channel. For 8 months, from February to August 1542, they drifted and paddled downstream, covering an estimated 4,700 kilometers. The journey was harrowing. They suffered from hunger, disease, and attacks from indigenous groups defending their territories. They stopped at villages to trade or beg for food, sometimes welcomed, often threatened or driven away. They improvised repairs to their boats, fashioned new equipment from forest materials, and adapted as best they could to an environment utterly foreign to their experience. Several men died, others were wounded in skirmishes, and all were exhausted by the time they finally reached the Atlantic in August 1542, emerging near the coast of present-day Venezuela. The expedition's chronicler, Friar Gaspar de Carvajal, kept a journal that provides the earliest European description of the Amazon's interior. His account is vivid and immediate, recording the expedition's desperation, but also their wonder at the river's scale and the societies they encountered. Carvajal described large villages with plazas and well-built houses, cultivated fields stretching back from the river, and organized defenses with warriors in canoes attacking the Spanish boats. One passage has become famous: Carvajal's description of an attack in which women warriors fought alongside or even led the defenders. He compared these women to the Amazons of Greek mythology, female warriors of legend. Whether Carvajal accurately observed women fighters, which would not be unprecedented in Amazonian cultures where women sometimes participated in warfare, or whether he misinterpreted what he saw, filtering it through European mythological expectations, remains debated. Regardless, the comparison stuck, and European maps soon labeled the Great River as the River of the Amazons, a name that eventually shortened to simply the Amazon. Carvajal's chronicle also conveys the psychological strain of the journey. Week after week, the expedition drifted through endless forest. The river seemed to have no end, winding through green walls of vegetation that revealed nothing of what lay beyond. Thunderstorms struck with sudden violence, turning day into night and filling the air with rain and lightning. At night, they anchored near shore, posting guards, listening to the forest sounds, bird calls, insect buzz, the splash of fish or caimans, and sometimes drums or voices from nearby villages. The journey transformed Orellana and his men from conquistadors seeking gold into survivors simply trying to reach the ocean. They had no interest in understanding the Amazon. They wanted only to escape it. But their accidental voyage established a route and demonstrated that the river could be navigated, information that would guide later expeditions. Following Orellana, a trickle of other Europeans ventured onto the Amazon. Spanish and Portuguese expeditions explored tributaries, established small settlements, and began the long, violent process of colonization. Missionaries, particularly Jesuits, established missions along the river, attempting to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity and to gather them into reducciones, mission villages where they could be controlled and instructed. These missions became sources of written records about indigenous cultures, though heavily filtered through missionary perspectives. Missionary accounts from the 16th and 17th centuries describe aspects of Amazonian life in detail. They noted the large dugout canoes carved from single tree trunks, some large enough to carry dozens of people and goods. They described multi-house villages organized around central plazas where ceremonies and communal activities occurred. They recorded agricultural practices, particularly manioc cultivation and processing, the complex steps required to remove toxins from bitter manioc and transform it into flour. They observed body painting with vegetable dyes and minerals, intricate patterns in black, red, and yellow that encoded social status, ritual states, or group affiliations. They marveled at feather headdresses that seemed to glow like embers in torchlight, crafted from the plumage of macaws, toucans, and other brilliant birds. But these observers also misunderstood much. They imposed European political categories, describing chiefs and kingdoms, where indigenous political organization might involve consensus-based leadership, ritual specialists without coercive power, or loose federations of autonomous communities. They recorded fragments of languages, enough to create dictionaries and catechisms for conversion purposes, but rarely grasped the cosmological concepts embedded in those languages. They witnessed night ceremonies, masked dances, music from flutes and drums, rituals in forest clearings, but treated these as superstition or devil worship, rather than as sophisticated religious and social practices. Despite their biases and limitations, these early texts preserved information that later proved invaluable. When diseases introduced by contact decimated indigenous populations, reducing some groups by 90% or more, and when colonial violence and displacement shattered social structures, the missionary records became among the few surviving written accounts of how societies had been organized, what languages had been spoken, what places had been named and inhabited. These documents are archives of worlds that colonization fragmented or destroyed, windows, however imperfect, into the Amazon before the full weight of European presence. As European and then Brazilian and other South American colonial powers consolidated control over the Amazon basin, expeditions increasingly served economic and scientific purposes. In the late 18th century, the Portuguese-Brazilian naturalist Alexandre Rodrigues Ferreira led a multi-year expedition through the Amazon and its tributaries, combining specimen collection with cartographic survey and economic assessment. Ferreira's expedition, lasting from 1783 to 1792, covered vast distances by canoe, traveling up the Negro, Branco, Madeira, and other rivers. Ferreira's methods depended entirely on indigenous and Afro-Brazilian boatmen and guides. These men knew the river's seasonal patterns, when to expect rising water, when channels would be passable, where rapids required portaging, where villages or camps offered safe stopping points. They decided when to travel at night, taking advantage of cooler temperatures and sometimes better visibility under moonlight, and when to camp, avoiding storms or potentially hostile encounters. Ferreira's scientific observations, plant specimens, animal skins, mineral samples, ethnographic sketches, were collected and preserved through their labor and knowledge. The early 19th century saw increased scientific interest in the Amazon as part of the broader European fascination with natural history and exploration. Alexander von Humboldt's journeys in North and South America, though they touched the Amazon basin only at its edges via the Orinoco-Negro connection, generated excitement about tropical biodiversity and inspired others to undertake similar expeditions. The Amazon, still largely unmapped from a European perspective and known to harbour extraordinary biological diversity, became a destination for naturalists willing to endure its hardships. In 1848, two young British naturalists, Henry Walter Bates and Alfred Russel Wallace, arrived in Pará at the Amazon's mouth with plans to collect specimens to sell to European museums and private collectors. Both men were largely self-taught naturalists from working-class backgrounds, and specimen collection offered a way to finance scientific work that they could not otherwise afford. They intended to work together, but after initial joint expeditions, they split up to cover more territory. Bates heading up the Amazon and Wallace eventually traveling the Rio Negro. Bates spent 11 years in the Amazon region, from 1848 to 1859. His travels took him up the main Amazon to the Tefe region and beyond, and into several tributaries. He was interested in everything, insects particularly, but also birds, reptiles, plants, and the ecology of rivers and forests. His collecting was prodigious. Over 11 years, he sent back to England more than 14,000 species, with about 8,000 new to science. These specimens filled museum drawers and provided material for taxonomic work that continued for decades after his return. But Bates was more than a collector. He was an observer, noting patterns in how species varied with habitat. He documented how butterflies found in Varzea forests differed from those in terra firma, how species changed as one moved upriver, how certain insects appeared only during specific seasons or flood stages. These observations, accumulated over years and across thousands of kilometers, revealed ecological principles that would later be formalized in biogeography and evolutionary theory. One pattern Bates documented became particularly influential. He noticed that some harmless butterflies resembled distasteful or toxic species so closely that predators avoided them. The mimicry was not perfect. Subtle differences in wing patterns or behavior existed, but it was effective enough to confer protection. This phenomenon, later termed Batesian mimicry, became an important example of natural selection in action, showing how resemblance could evolve through survival advantages conferred by confusion with dangerous models. Bates's daily routine during his years in the Amazon followed a pattern shaped by the environment. Mornings were for collecting, walking forest trails, searching along river edges, visiting clearings where butterflies congregated at flowers or muddy spots. Midday heat drove him to shelter, where he sorted specimens, made notes, and prepared insects for preservation by pinning them and treating them with preservatives to prevent decay in the humid climate. Evenings often brought renewed activity as nocturnal insects appeared, attracted to lanterns, and Bates would sort through the visitors, selecting specimens and observing behaviors. Nights were for writing, letters home, journal entries, descriptions of new species, by candlelight, while the forest buzzed and chirped beyond his camp or lodging. Alfred Russel Wallace's time in the Amazon from 1848 to 1852 was shorter than Bates's, but equally intense. Wallace travelled from Pará up the Amazon and then turned into the Rio Negro, eventually reaching the Upper Negro and its connection to the Orinoco system. His goal, in part, was to reach and surpass points that Humboldt had visited, checking Humboldt's measurements and observations while collecting specimens and making his own notes on geography, climate, and natural history. Wallace paid particular attention to patterns of species distribution. He noted that certain species were found only on one side of a major river, with different but related species on the opposite bank. This suggested that rivers acted as barriers to dispersal, isolating populations and allowing them to diverge over time. He documented how bird and insect assemblages changed from whitewater to blackwater rivers and from floodplain to terra, firm forests. Early observations of what would later be understood as habitat specialization and ecological partitioning. Disaster struck Wallace on his return to England in 1852. The ship carrying him and most of his collections caught fire in mid-Atlantic. The crew and passengers escaped in lifeboats, but the ship and its cargo were lost. Wallace managed to save a few papers and notebooks, but years of carefully prepared specimens, bird skins, preserved insects, botanical samples, ethnographic items, went to the bottom of the ocean. The loss was devastating both personally and financially, as Wallace had counted on selling the specimens to finance future work. The loss of his Amazon collections meant that much of Wallace's work had to be reconstructed from memory and from the fragments he had saved. His subsequent book, a narrative of travels on the Amazon and Rio Negro, published in 1853, lacked the detailed specimen lists and technical descriptions that his collections would have supported, but it conveyed the experience of Amazonian travel and established Wallace as a serious naturalist, paving the way for his later expedition to Southeast Asia, where he developed, independently of Darwin, the theory of evolution by natural selection. The work of naturalists like Bates and Wallace established the Amazon as an epicenter of biodiversity. Their collections and publications demonstrated that the number of species in Amazonian forests far exceeded anything previously documented. This realization drove further expeditions. Botanists catalogued the extraordinary diversity of trees, hundreds of species in a single hectare, a level of diversity that would be remarkable across an entire region in temperate forests. Ornithologists documented bird species by the hundreds, from tiny hummingbirds to massive harpy eagles. Entomologists found that insect diversity seemed almost limitless, with new species turning up in virtually every sample. These naturalists depended heavily on local knowledge. Indigenous and mestizo guides pointed out useful plants, explained seasonal patterns, demonstrated how to process toxic plants into food or medicine, and shared place names and stories. Some naturalists acknowledged this debt explicitly. Others treated local informants as anonymous labor. But the reality was that much of what was collected and described as new to European science had long been known, named, and used by Amazonian peoples. The discovery of Amazonian biodiversity was in many ways a translation project, converting indigenous knowledge into European taxonomic categories and sending material evidence, dried plants, preserved animals, seeds, to institutions where it could be studied and classified according to Western scientific frameworks. As the 19th century progressed, the Amazon increasingly attracted attention not just for its biology, but for economic exploitation. One product in particular would transform the region: rubber. Natural rubber, extracted from Hevea brasiliensis, trees growing wild in Amazonian forests, had been used by indigenous peoples for centuries to make waterproof containers, balls, and other objects. European and North American manufacturers began experimenting with rubber in the early 19th century, but it remained a minor commodity until Charles Goodyear's development of vulcanization in the 1830s made rubber more durable and useful. The invention of pneumatic tires in the late 19th century and their adoption for bicycles and eventually automobiles created enormous demand for rubber. For several decades, the Amazon had a virtual monopoly on rubber production, as all rubber came from wild trees tapped by collectors working deep in the forest. The rubber boom transformed Amazonian cities like Manaus and Belém into wealthy export centers. Manaus, hundreds of kilometers upriver from the Atlantic, became improbably cosmopolitan, its wealth built on rubber allowing construction of an opera house, electrification, and amenities that seemed incongruous in the middle of the rainforest. But the wealth concentrated in export cities was built on brutal exploitation in the forest. Rubber extraction required tapping trees scattered through vast areas of forest, then processing the latex by smoking it over fires to coagulate it into balls or sheets. The work was arduous, dangerous, and often conducted under coercive systems. Rubber bosses advanced goods to tappers on credit, trapping them in debt peonage where they could never earn enough to repay what they owed. In some regions, particularly the Putumayo on the border between Peru and Colombia, the system descended into outright slavery and terror, with indigenous populations forced to collect rubber under threat of violence, hostage-taking of family members, and murder. The exposure of Putumayo atrocities in the early 20th century shocked international audiences and led to investigations and reforms, though the rubber boom was already waning by then. In 1906, rubber seeds smuggled out of the Amazon by Henry Wickham. In 1876, began producing rubber in British plantations in Malaysia and other Southeast Asian colonies. Plantation rubber, grown in neat rows where trees could be systematically tapped, proved far more efficient than wild collection. By the 1920s, plantation rubber dominated the market, and the Amazonian rubber boom collapsed, leaving behind ghost towns, abandoned forest camps, and traumatized populations. The rubber era reshaped Amazonian human geography. Many indigenous groups fled deeper into the forest or shifted their movements to avoid contact with rubber collectors. Villages along well-traveled rivers were abandoned as people retreated to tributary headwaters where they might remain hidden. Some groups lost so many members to violence and disease that they effectively disappeared as distinct peoples, their survivors absorbed into other communities or into the growing mestizo population. The rubber boom is thus a dark chapter in Amazonian history, a period when economic demand from industrialized countries drove exploitation that devastated local populations. Even as rubber extraction was transforming the Amazon's human landscape, scientific exploration continued and intensified. From the late 19th century into the 20th, national governments and international organizations sponsored systematic mapping and surveying of the Amazon basin. Brazilian, Peruvian, Colombian, and other national cartographic services sent expeditions to measure river channels, record altitudes, fix coordinates, and produce accurate maps where earlier charts had been vague or speculative. Steamships made travel faster and more predictable than the canoes and sailboats that earlier explorers had used. Regular steamer routes connected Manaus and Belém to river towns up the Amazon and major tributaries, carrying mail, passengers, and cargo. These steamers required fuel stops, and wood yards appeared along navigable rivers, creating economic opportunities and changing patterns of settlement. The steamers also required navigational information, charts showing hazards, channel depths, safe anchorages. And this information was gradually compiled into pilot books and maps. Telegraph lines reached the Amazon in the early 20th century, connecting previously isolated regions to national and global communication networks. The extension of the telegraph required surveying routes, building stations, and maintaining lines through regions where humidity and insects constantly threatened equipment. The Brazilian army officer Cândido Rondon led some of these expeditions, combining telegraph construction with scientific observation and contact with previously isolated indigenous groups. Rondon's expeditions, while sometimes controversial, demonstrated a relatively respectful approach to indigenous peoples, seeking to establish peaceful relations rather than resorting immediately to force. One of the most dramatic mapping expeditions of the early 20th century combined scientific survey with personal redemption. In 1913, former US President Theodore Roosevelt, seeking purpose after his failed attempt to return to the presidency, joined Brazilian explorer Cândido Rondon to map an unknown tributary in the western Amazon. The river, called the Rio da Dúvida, the River of Doubt, flowed north from the Brazilian highlands, but its course and destination were unmapped. The expedition departed in December 1913 with a team of Brazilians and Americans, including Roosevelt, Rondon, Roosevelt's son Kermit, and naturalist George Cherry. The plan was to descend the River of Doubt by canoe, surveying and mapping as they went, determining where this river ultimately flowed. What was expected to take perhaps 6 weeks became a nearly 3-month ordeal that almost killed Roosevelt and did kill 3 expedition members. The river proved treacherous. Rapids appeared with dangerous frequency, requiring portages where heavy dugout canoes had to be carried through dense forest around the obstacles. One canoe was lost with valuable supplies. Food ran low. In the humid heat, small injuries became infected wounds. Roosevelt gashed his leg badly during one portage, and the wound became seriously infected, leaving him feverish and delirious. At one point, believing himself a burden, he urged the others to leave him and continue. They refused, and eventually, the infection subsided enough for him to travel, though he never fully recovered his health. The expedition did achieve its mapping goals. They surveyed the river's course, determining that it flowed into the Madeira and thence to the Amazon, adding roughly 1,500 kilometers of previously unmapped river to Brazilian charts. In recognition of Roosevelt's near-fatal ordeal, the river was renamed the Rio Roosevelt, though it's also still known as the Rio Teodoro. The expedition's findings were published, and Roosevelt's account, through the Brazilian wilderness, became a best-selling narrative of exploration and survival. The Roosevelt-Rondon expedition represented a particular moment in Amazonian exploration, the early 20th century drive to fill in the remaining blank spaces on maps, backed by national governments seeking to assert control over remote territories. Rondon's role connected this expedition to his broader work extending telegraph lines and making peaceful contact with indigenous groups, while Roosevelt's participation brought international attention to Brazilian Amazonia and to the challenges of tropical exploration. By the mid-20th century, the Amazon was no longer unknown territory from a geographic perspective. The major rivers had been mapped, their courses and major features documented, but biological and cultural knowledge remained fragmentary. The forest harbored countless species yet to be described, and many indigenous languages and cultures remained little documented. Modern scientific work increasingly recognized that understanding the Amazon required collaboration with those who lived there, whose knowledge encoded generations of observation and experience. From the 1960s onward, long-term ecological research programs were established in the Amazon. Permanent forest plots were set up where every tree above a certain size was tagged, measured, and monitored over years and decades. These plots revealed dynamics invisible in short-term studies, how tree species composition changes over time, how growth rates vary with climate fluctuations, how occasional disturbances like windstorms shape forest structure. River monitoring programs tracked fish populations, water chemistry, and seasonal patterns, documenting the immense productivity of Vasia floodplains and the adaptations of fish to flood cycles. Ethnobotanical and ethnoecological research grew more sophisticated and collaborative. Scientists worked with indigenous experts, recording plant names in local languages, documenting uses and preparation methods, mapping territories and resource areas. These collaborations revealed that indigenous knowledge systems are vast and detailed, encoding information about hundreds or thousands of plant species, complex ecological relationships, and sustainable management practices developed over centuries. The knowledge is often geographically specific. What works in one river valley may not apply elsewhere, and it is transmitted through stories, practical training, and experiential learning rather than through written texts. Linguistic documentation became another priority. Many Amazonian languages are spoken by small populations, sometimes only a few hundred people, and they are vulnerable to loss as younger generations shift to Portuguese or Spanish. Each language encodes unique ways of categorizing the world, unique conceptual frameworks for understanding relationships between people, animals, plants, and places. Linguists working in the Amazon race against time, documenting grammars and vocabularies before languages disappear, often working with elders who are the last fluent speakers. Modern research has also embraced technology that earlier explorers could never have imagined. Satellite imagery reveals the extent of deforestation and tracks changes in forest cover over time. Remote sensing using LiDAR, laser scanning from aircraft, penetrates the forest canopy to map ground topography and detect archaeological features hidden beneath vegetation. Camera traps record wildlife behavior without human presence, revealing nocturnal animals and rare species that direct observation might miss. Acoustic monitoring using automated recorders documents frog choruses, bird songs, and insect sounds, creating audio archives that can be analyzed for patterns of diversity and seasonality. Yet for all this technology, much Amazonian research still follows patterns established by earlier naturalists. Scientists travel by boat, spend weeks or months at field stations with basic facilities, collect specimens and observations by patient daily effort, and depend on local boatmen, guides, and assistants whose knowledge makes the work possible. Nighttime at research stations often involves conversations on verandas above the river, comparing observations, discussing what has been seen and what it might mean, listening to the forest nocturnal soundscape while data loggers and sensors quietly record measurements. The Amazon today faces pressures that early explorers could not have anticipated. Deforestation for agriculture, logging, mining, and infrastructure development has removed significant portions of the forest, particularly in more accessible areas along major rivers and roads. Climate change is altering rainfall patterns and river flows, with potential consequences for ecosystems adapted to predictable seasonal cycles. Mercury contamination from gold mining poisons rivers and accumulates in fish that people depend on for food. Roads and dams fragment habitat and disrupt animal movements. Indigenous peoples and traditional communities who have long been stewards of the forest are increasingly asserting their rights to land and to manage resources according to their own knowledge and values. Legal recognition of indigenous territories has provided some protection against deforestation, as satellite data show that forests within indigenous lands often remain intact, while surrounding areas are cleared. But these communities face ongoing threats from illegal logging, mining, land invasion, and violence from those seeking to exploit resources. The question of who has authority to speak about the Amazon, to define its value, and to make decisions about its future remains contested. For centuries, outsiders treated the Amazon as a resource to be exploited or a wilderness to be conquered. More recently, narratives of conservation sometimes positioned the Amazon as a global resource, the lungs of the earth, needing protection from those who live there. Indigenous and traditional communities push back against both narratives, asserting that they are not threats to the forest, but rather its protectors, that their knowledge and management practices have maintained biodiversity for generations, and that any sustainable future for the Amazon must be built on their leadership rather than imposed from outside. The stories of Amazonian exploration traced in this script span millennia and multiple perspectives. The earliest explorers were the first peoples who moved into the basin thousands of years ago, learning its seasons and resources, developing technologies and knowledge that allowed them to thrive in an environment that seemed impenetrable to later outsiders. Later, indigenous migrations and cultural developments continued this exploration, creating the diverse tapestry of languages, technologies, and social forms that Europeans encountered. European exploration, beginning with Pinzon and Orellana, and continuing through centuries of colonial expansion, was often characterized by misunderstanding, violence, and extraction. Yet it also included individuals who sought to document and understand what they found, naturalists like Bates and Wallace, ethnographers who recorded languages and stories, surveyors who mapped rivers and compiled knowledge. Their work, however flawed and however tainted by colonial context, contributed to broader human knowledge about one of Earth's most complex ecosystems. Modern exploration of the Amazon, conducted increasingly by Brazilian and other South American scientists in addition to international researchers, seeks different goals than earlier expeditions. Rather than claiming territory or extracting resources, the aim is understanding how the forest works, how species interact, how ecosystems respond to change, and increasingly, this exploration involves recognizing and valuing indigenous and traditional knowledge, understanding that those who have lived in the forest longest often understand it most deeply. As you drift towards sleep tonight, imagine yourself on a river in the Amazon basin. Perhaps you are on the main channel, immense and brown, its far bank a distant line of trees. Or perhaps you're on a smaller tributary, black water clear enough to see fish swimming below, the forest canopy closing overhead. It is evening, and the day's heat is fading. You are on a boat, perhaps a dugout canoe, perhaps a small motorized launch, perhaps a research vessel, and you are traveling upstream against the current that has carried explorers downstream for centuries. The river is alive with movement. Fish jump, sending ripples across the surface. A caiman's eyes reflect your lantern light from the bank. Birds settle into roosts, their calls echoing across the water. Somewhere in the forest, monkeys vocalize, claiming territory or warning of predators. Insects begin their nighttime chorus, a sound so ubiquitous that it becomes almost a silence, a background against which other sounds occur. Your boat moves slowly against the current. The engine or paddle strokes a steady rhythm. On the banks, occasionally, you see lights, a village or homestead, people living their lives along the river, as their ancestors have for generations. Sometimes you pass a beach where turtles will come to nest when the season is right, or a floating meadow of grass and water, hyacinth drifting downstream. a temporary island hosting insects and birds and fish, sheltering beneath its roots. The night deepens. Stars appear, brilliant in the absence of light pollution. The Milky Way a bright band across the sky. The Southern Cross hangs above the horizon, the constellation that guided navigators for centuries. The forest becomes a dark wall on either side, its details invisible, but its presence felt. The source of sounds, the smell of vegetation and earth, the sense of immensity. You understand, in this moment, something of what earlier travelers experienced: the river's power, the forest's mystery, the feeling of being small within a landscape of continental scale. But you also understand something they often missed: that this place is not unknown, not empty, not waiting to be discovered. People have known this river, this forest, for millennia. What seems like wilderness to outsiders is home to those who belong here. The boat continues upstream. Perhaps you will reach a research station, a village, a camp. Perhaps you will anchor in mid-river and sleep to the sound of water against the hull and the night sounds of the forest. But the journey itself, the slow movement through darkness, the patient progress against the current, is what matters. This is exploration not as conquest or discovery, but as attention, as the gradual learning of a place that can never be fully known, that always holds more complexity than any observer can grasp. Rest now on the river. Let the current push against the boat, a constant gentle force. Let the forest sounds wash over you, frog calls, insect buzz, the occasional splash or cry. Let the rhythm of travel, the engine's hum or the paddle's dip, lull you towards sleep. The Amazon flows on, carrying water from 1,000 sources toward the sea, its channels branching and rejoining in patterns too complex for any map to fully capture. People continue to live along its banks, to fish its waters, to know its seasons. Scientists continue to study its ecology, to document its species, to marvel at its complexity. And the forest continues, its processes of growth and decay, predation and symbiosis, competition and cooperation playing out in countless interactions that constitute one of Earth's most biodiverse ecosystems. The Amazon awaits those willing to listen, to learn, to recognize that the greatest exploration is not the first arrival, but the patient, humble, ongoing work of understanding. May you rest in that understanding, and may your dreams carry you gently along the water's flow, through the darkness and toward the dawn. The preparation for river journeys in the Amazon has its own rhythms and requirements, patterns that have evolved over centuries of travel. Indigenous travelers learned to read the seasons, knowing when rivers would be high enough for certain passages, when fishing would be productive, when particular fruits would ripen along the banks. European explorers and later scientists had to learn these patterns, often painfully, through trial and error or through reliance on local guides. A typical expedition in the 19th or early 20th century required months of preparation. Supplies had to be gathered, not just food and equipment for the expedition members, but trade goods for exchange with riverine communities, gifts for leaders whose territory the expedition would pass through, and goods to pay boatmen and assistants. Trade items might include metal tools, cloth, beads, fishhooks, knives, objects that indigenous and mestizo communities valued and that could be exchanged for food, labor, or safe passage. The boats themselves required careful selection and often custom construction. Dugout canoes, hollowed from massive tree trunks, were the traditional vessels, and they remained essential well into the 20th century for navigating smaller rivers and shallow channels. But larger expeditions needed more cargo capacity. which meant larger canoes or constructed boats. Some naturalists commissioned boats built to their specifications, with covered sections to protect specimens and equipment from rain, with comfortable seating for long days on the water, with storage holds organized for efficient packing and unpacking. Crew selection was equally important. The paddlers and pilots had to be experienced river travelers, capable of reading currents, recognizing hazards, and managing boats through rapids or around submerged obstacles. They needed to know where to find firewood and fresh water, where beaches would be safe for camping, where communities might offer hospitality. Often, crew members spoke multiple indigenous languages in addition to Portuguese or Spanish, allowing them to communicate with diverse groups along the route. Without capable crew, no expedition succeeded. With poor crew, expeditions might end in disaster. The daily rhythm of river travel followed patterns shaped by climate and river conditions. Expeditions typically started travel before dawn, taking advantage of cool morning hours and the calm that often preceded the day's heat. By mid-morning, the sun would be intense, and travelers would seek shade, either beneath awnings on boats or by stopping at camps. Midday hours might be spent resting, preparing food, sorting specimens, or making minor repairs to boats and equipment. Late afternoon might see more travel as temperatures moderated, and sometimes expeditions traveled into early evening or even at night if conditions were favorable. Night travel had particular advantages and risks. Advantages included cooler temperatures, sometimes better visibility under a bright moon, and the opportunity to observe nocturnal wildlife. Fishermen timed their work to night hours when certain fish were active. Risks included difficulty seeing hazards like floating logs, increased danger of running aground on sandbars, and the challenges of navigating without clear landmarks. Experienced pilots could manage these risks, reading the river by the sound of current, by subtle changes in water texture, by memorized knowledge of channels and bends. Campsites along the river became familiar to frequent travelers. Certain beaches offered good landing spots, level ground for sleeping, and proximity to fresh water. Certain locations near villages or homesteads offered opportunities to trade for food or seek shelter during storms. These camps accumulated history, generations of travelers stopping at the same spots, perhaps leaving marks or messages, knowing they were part of a long chain of movements along the river. At camp, routines were established. Someone was assigned to prepare food, which on long expeditions often meant rice or manioc flour, cooked with whatever fish or game could be caught. Someone would set up sleeping arrangements, hammocks strung between trees, mosquito nets carefully arranged, protection from rain if needed. Naturalists would sort the day's collections, noting where specimens were found, preparing insects by pinning them while still pliable, pressing plants between papers, preserving reptile or fish specimens in alcohol. Notes were written by lantern light, letters composed to be sent when the expedition next reached a town with postal service. Nighttime in camp was both social and observational. Crew members would talk, tell stories, perhaps play music if instruments were available. Naturalists would listen to night sounds, identifying calls and trying to match them to species. Sometimes indigenous companions would explain what sounds meant, which frogs called when rain approached, which birds sang only during certain moon phases, which night animals were dangerous or sacred. These conversations, half teaching and half cultural exchange, often provided insights that formal observation could not. The night forest itself demanded attention. After dark, a different set of creatures emerged. Moths of enormous size came to lanterns, their wings spanning the width of a hand, their patterns intricate and startling. Frogs called from every direction, a cacophony that naturalists tried to pass into individual species. Large animals sometimes approached camp, tapirs coming to drink, peccaries moving in groups. Occasionally, a jaguar's eyeshine caught in lantern light at the edge of vision. The calls of potus and nightjars echoed through the darkness, eerie and ventriloquial, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. For indigenous peoples traveling their own territories, nights on the river carried different meanings. Travel might be tied to ceremonial calendars, with journeys timed to lunar cycles, or to seasonal markers like the flowering of certain trees. The river at night was not just a physical space, but a spiritual one, where encounters with non-human persons, spirits, ancestors, powerful animals, were possible and sometimes necessary. Songs and prayers might accompany night travel, protecting travelers and showing respect to the beings whose territory they moved through. The practical knowledge required for Amazonian travel was vast and detailed. Boatmen learned to read water currents to determine depth and the presence of obstacles. Clear, rippling water indicated shallows. Smooth, dark water might hide submerged logs or rocks. The surface texture changed where tributaries met the main channel, where underwater topography altered flow patterns. These visual cues had to be learned through experience, as each river section had its own characteristics. Navigation without modern instruments required multiple strategies. Landmarks were memorized, distinctive trees, rock formations, the shape of bends. River confluences served as major reference points, and many places were named for the meeting of waters. For instance, Manaus is near the Rio Negro's confluence with the Amazon, where black and brown waters run side by side for kilometers before mixing. Distances were often reckoned in travel time rather than kilometers. 3 days from this village to that confluence, 5 hours from this rapid to that beach. These time-based distances varied with season and water level, as currents were stronger during high water, and channels might be longer or shorter, depending on which route remained passable. River levels themselves were carefully observed. High water during the wet season, roughly December through May in the central Amazon, inundated forests and created vast flooded zones. Rivers became wider and sometimes faster, and navigation shifted to avoid strong currents and to take advantage of back channels and quieter waters. Trees that stood on dry land during low water became islands during floods, with fish swimming through their canopies and animals retreating to upper branches. Low water during the dry season exposed beaches and sandbars, revealed rapids and rock formations that had been submerged, and sometimes made navigation difficult or impossible in smaller channels. These seasonal changes affected what could be harvested and where. Turtle nesting occurred during low water when beaches were exposed. Certain fish species migrated with the seasonal flood pulse, moving into flooded forest to feed when water was high, and concentrating in main channels when water fell. Fruits from trees that dropped seeds into floodwaters attracted fish during high water, and fishermen learned which trees' fruiting seasons produced the best fishing. This knowledge was ecological and temporal, encoded in cultural practices and annual cycles. The naturalists working in the Amazon during the 19th and early 20th centuries gradually came to appreciate this complexity. Initial collections focused on spectacular or obvious species, large butterflies, brilliant birds, striking fish. But sustained observation revealed that less conspicuous species were often more significant ecologically. The myriad small beetles, the subtle brown birds of understory, the fish species that could be distinguished only by careful examination of fin rays and scale counts. These constituted the bulk of diversity and played crucial roles in forest and river functions. Collecting techniques evolved with understanding. Early naturalists used shotguns to collect birds, a destructive method that damaged specimens and could only sample species that flew within range. Over time, mist nets, fine mesh nets strung between poles, allowed capture of birds alive and unharmed, permitting detailed examination, measurement, banding, and release. Similar innovations occurred in collecting insects, fish, and plants, with methods becoming more precise and less wasteful. The preservation of specimens in tropical conditions presented constant challenges. Heat and humidity accelerated decay. Insects not properly dried and treated quickly developed mold, or attracted museum pests that could destroy entire collections. Fish and reptiles preserved in alcohol had to be transferred to fresh alcohol periodically as the initial preservative became contaminated. Plant specimens required daily changing of pressing papers to prevent mold, a tedious process made more difficult by humid conditions where papers dried slowly. These technical challenges meant that collecting was only part of the work. Equally important was the meticulous care of specimens until they could be shipped to museums. The emotional and psychological dimensions of Amazonian exploration also deserve attention. Travelers spent months or even years away from home, living in conditions of discomfort and sometimes hardship. Tropical diseases were constant threats: malaria, yellow fever, leishmaniasis, various parasitic infections. Before modern medicines, these diseases were often debilitating and sometimes fatal. Many explorers suffered repeated bouts of fever, treating themselves with quinine when it was available, or simply enduring illness and hoping for recovery. Isolation weighed on travelers. Communication with the outside world was sporadic, limited to occasions when riverboats carrying mail passed, or when expeditions reached towns with postal services. News from home might be months old when received, and responses took months more to return. The uncertainty about what was happening elsewhere, the inability to respond to crises at home, and the sense of being cut off from familiar places and people created psychological strains. Yet many naturalists wrote about their time in the Amazon with affection and even longing. Despite the hardships, there was the joy of discovery, seeing species never before described, observing behaviors never recorded, experiencing landscapes of extraordinary beauty. The slow pace of river travel allowed sustained attention to detail, noticing patterns that faster movement would miss. The enforced simplicity of expedition life, few possessions, daily routines focused on essential tasks, close connection to natural cycles, offered a kind of clarity sometimes missing in more complex urban existences. The aesthetic experience of the Amazon also mattered to travelers. The play of light on water, the infinite shades of green in the forest, the sudden brilliance of a macaw flock flying overhead, the architectural complexity of a termite mound, the delicate structure of an orchid flower. These visual experiences stayed with travelers and appeared in their writings, attempts to convey in words what they saw and felt. Some travelers were accomplished artists, creating watercolor paintings or detailed drawings. These visual records serve scientific purposes, documenting colors that faded in preserved specimens, showing species in life positions, illustrating habitats. But they were also artistic expressions, efforts to capture the forest's beauty. The relationship between scientific explorers and the indigenous and mestizo people they depended on varied greatly. Some naturalists treated local assistance as mere labor, valued for physical strength and river skills, but otherwise ignored or dismissed. Others developed genuine friendships and collaborations, learning languages, participating in community life when opportunities arose, and acknowledging debts of knowledge and assistance in their writings. These different approaches often correlated with the quality of the scientific work. Those who listened and learned from local experts gained insights that those who maintained rigid hierarchies missed. Language was always a challenge and sometimes a bridge. Many naturalists arrived knowing only Spanish or Portuguese and had to learn to communicate with people who spoke indigenous languages. Some made real efforts to learn these languages, at least at basic levels, finding that language learning opened doors to understanding how people categorized and thought about their environment. Others relied entirely on interpreters, which limited communication to what interpreters chose to translate and how they framed information. The indigenous perspective on scientific explorers was complex. Naturalists collecting specimens could seem strange or even mad. Why would someone spend hours catching insects only to kill and preserve them? Why measure and document plants that everyone already knew? Sometimes collecting aroused suspicion, particularly when it involved sacred or dangerous species that local belief systems said should not be disturbed. Other times, indigenous people found ways to benefit from naturalist presence, trading food and knowledge for goods or payment, using the economic opportunities that expeditions provided. From an indigenous viewpoint, the land and river that outsiders were exploring was home, intimately known and deeply meaningful. The scientists' questions about place names, about what animals lived where, about which plants were useful. These questions had obvious answers to anyone who lived there. The notion that this information was being recorded for people far away who had never visited and never would visit the region must have seemed peculiar. Yet many indigenous people cooperated with ethnographic and scientific documentation, perhaps understanding that the information might have value, that recording knowledge might help preserve it, or simply because the economic exchange was useful. The rubber boom's legacy continued to shape the Amazon long after the boom itself ended. The population movements it caused, indigenous people fleeing into remote areas, migrants from Brazil's northeast arriving as rubber tappers, merchants and traders establishing river towns, permanently altered demographic patterns. Many traditional indigenous territories were depopulated or fragmented. Mixed mestizo communities formed along major rivers, combining indigenous, European, and African ancestry and cultural elements. Languages shifted, with Portuguese and Spanish becoming dominant, and many indigenous languages declining or disappearing. The rubber barons' mansions in Manaus and Belém, built with wealth extracted from forest labor, became monuments to a particular historical moment, a time when remote Amazonian products briefly commanded global prices, and when fortunes could be made through control of wild resources. When plantation rubber ended the boom, these cities declined, and the grand buildings fell into disrepair. Later, 20th century development brought new industries and new wealth, but the rubber-era architecture remained, a reminder of the Amazon's integration into global economic systems and of the human costs of that integration. Conservation movements emerging in the late 20th century brought new attention to the Amazon, framing it as a critical component of Earth's climate system, a storehouse of biodiversity, and a landscape requiring protection. These framings were not wrong, but they sometimes oversimplified the Amazon's reality and the politics of conservation. Designating areas as protected parks or reserves often affected the indigenous and traditional communities living there, sometimes displacing them or restricting their activities in ways that caused hardship without their consent or meaningful participation in decision-making. More recent conservation approaches have tried to incorporate local communities as partners rather than as obstacles. The recognition that indigenous territories often maintain better forest cover than government reserves has led to support for indigenous land rights as a conservation strategy. Community-based natural resource management, where local people have authority and incentives to maintain forests and manage harvests sustainably, has shown promise. These approaches require respecting local knowledge and governance systems, providing support without imposing external control, and ensuring that communities benefit from conservation rather than bearing only its costs. Scientific research stations scattered through the Amazon now serve as long-term observation points, places where ecological processes can be studied over years and decades. These stations vary widely. Some are well-equipped facilities with laboratories and accommodations. Others are basic camps with minimal infrastructure. Research at these sites follows seasonal rhythms. Scientists arrive for field seasons timed to particular phenomena: bird breeding, fruit production, fish migrations, insect emergencies. Between field seasons, stations are maintained by local staff, and data collection continues through automated sensors and occasional visits. Life at a research station combines scientific work with the routines of living in a remote forest setting. Days begin early, before heat makes physical exertion difficult. Mornings might be spent checking animal traps, walking census transects, collecting water samples, or conducting experiments. Midday heat drives people to shelter, where data are entered, specimens processed, and equipment maintained. Late afternoon and evening bring cooler temperatures and renewed activity, both human and ecological. Dinners are communal, eaten on verandas or in dining areas, followed by evening discussions, planning for next day's work, and sometimes night work. Spotlight surveys for nocturnal animals, monitoring of bat activity, recording of night sounds. The stations become communities, albeit temporary ones. Researchers from various countries and institutions work side by side, sharing facilities and sometimes collaborating on projects. Graduate students conduct dissertation research, learning field techniques and coping with the challenges of tropical work. Local assistants bring essential skills: boat operation, animal identification, knowledge of trails and seasons, and also benefit from employment and sometimes training opportunities. These intersections of people and purposes create social dynamics distinct from either typical scientific labs or local communities, hybrid spaces where different forms of knowledge and practice meet. Technology has transformed some aspects of Amazonian research while leaving others remarkably unchanged. GPS devices and satellite imagery allow precise mapping and navigation, but researchers still travel by boat along rivers, walk trails through forests, and spend hours observing and recording by hand. Automated sensors can record temperature, humidity, and rainfall continuously, but understanding what these measurements mean requires human interpretation informed by ecological knowledge. DNA analysis can identify species from tiny tissue samples, but collecting those samples still requires finding and catching animals in the wild. The blend of high-tech and traditional methods reflects the reality that scientific understanding requires both technological capability and direct patient observation. The ethical dimensions of Amazonian research have received increasing attention. Historical examples of exploitation, specimens and knowledge taken without permission or fair compensation, publications that credited researchers but not local collaborators, findings used in ways that harmed communities, have prompted calls for more equitable practices. Some Amazonian countries have enacted laws regulating scientific collecting and requiring benefit-sharing arrangements. International protocols call for free, prior, and informed consent from indigenous communities before research in their territories, and for indigenous co-authorship when their knowledge contributes to scientific findings. These changes acknowledge that research is not neutral, but occurs within contexts of power and history. Outside researchers have resources, funding, institutional support, training that local communities lack, creating imbalances. Research findings can be used in ways that communities have no control over. For instance, discovery of a medically useful plant might lead to commercial development with no benefit flowing back to the people who originally used and shared information about that plant. More equitable research partnerships aim to address these issues, ensuring that research benefits communities directly, that indigenous knowledge is properly credited and compensated, and that communities have say in how research is conducted and what happens with its results. The question of where the Amazon begins has fascinated explorers for centuries, but definitive answers required modern technology. For most of the river's documented history, the Amazon was considered to begin where the Marañón and Ucayali rivers meet in Peru. But which stream feeding those rivers could claim to be the ultimate source? In the 1970s, a series of expeditions supported by National Geographic and involving Andean explorers began investigating candidate sources in the Peruvian Andes. These expeditions used improved mapping techniques and careful measurements of stream lengths and flows to trace tributaries back to their origins. The work identified Nevado Mismi, a peak in southern Peru, as a strong candidate. A stream beginning from snowmelt and springs on Mismi slopes could be traced through the Apurimac River system into the Ucayali and eventually the Amazon. Later expeditions in the 1990s and 2000s, using GPS technology and more precise mapping, refined these conclusions and confirmed that the Amazon's most distant source lies on Nevado Mismi, or very near it, about 5,200 meters above sea level and roughly 6,400 kilometers from the Atlantic. These measurements settled long-standing debates about the Amazon's length and established its claim to being the world's longest river when measured from its most distant source, though the Nile remains longer when measured by other criteria. The source expeditions demonstrated that exploration of the Amazon continues. Even basic geographical questions, where does it begin, exactly how long is it, required modern technology to answer definitively. The work also highlighted the Amazon's Andean connections, reminding observers that this quintessentially lowland tropical river begins in high-altitude glacial environments, with implications for how climate change affecting Andean glaciers might impact downstream flows. Climate change adds urgency to Amazonian research and conservation. The Amazon plays crucial roles in global climate, cycling vast amounts of water through evapotranspiration, storing enormous quantities of carbon in its biomass and soils, and influencing atmospheric circulation patterns across South America and beyond. Deforestation and degradation reduce these functions, potentially triggering feedback loops that could shift the Amazon toward a drier state, perhaps converting portions to savanna. Such a transformation would be catastrophic, not just for Amazonian biodiversity, but for regional and global climate. Monitoring climate impacts requires long-term data, Permanent forest plots show subtle changes in tree species composition, with some species becoming more common and others declining, possibly in response to changing rainfall or temperature patterns. Bird populations shift, with some species expanding their ranges and others contracting. Fish catches change as river flows vary and water temperatures rise. These changes accumulate slowly, often imperceptibly, year to year, but clearly visible over decades. The long-term research stations provide crucial continuity, allowing scientists to detect trends that shorter studies would miss. Indigenous communities also observe and report changes. Altered fruiting times for important trees, shifts in fish migration timing, changes in river levels or flood duration, appearance of new pests or diseases. These observations, filtered through generations of experience and recorded in oral traditions, complement scientific measurements. Collaborative projects that integrate indigenous observations with scientific monitoring produce fuller pictures of what is changing and how communities are affected. Adaptation strategies emerge from these collaborations. If fish migrations shift, fishing strategies must adjust. If certain crop varieties become less productive under altered climate conditions, experimentation with alternatives becomes necessary. If rainfall patterns change, water management for gardens and communities requires modification. These adaptations draw on traditional ecological knowledge, understanding of alternatives, flexibility in practice, experience with variation, combined with new information and sometimes external support for trying new approaches. The story of the Amazon is unfinished, still unfolding. The basin contains regions that remain poorly studied, species yet to be described, ecological interactions yet to be understood. Indigenous languages continue to encode knowledge that has never been written down. The dynamic between conservation and development, between traditional livelihoods and modern economic pressures, between local autonomy and national or global interests, continues to play out in communities and landscapes across the region. What began with ancient migrations into a post-glacial landscape continued through millennia of indigenous development and then through centuries of colonial intrusion and exploitation, now proceeds through an era of environmental concern and indigenous rights assertion. Each phase has left its marks on the landscape and on human communities. Understanding the Amazon requires attention to all these layers: geological time that shaped the river and forest, human time that populated and modified the environment, historical time that brought disease and disruption and extraction, and contemporary time that grapples with conservation and climate change and questions of justice and sustainability. For the listener settling into sleep, the Amazon offers images and sounds that can guide rest. Imagine the gentle lap of water against a boat hull, the whisper of current around a submerged log. Imagine the evening calls of birds settling for night, the gradual crescendo of frog and insect song as darkness deepens. Imagine stars reflected on black water, the Milky Way brilliant above the forest canopy. Imagine the sense of being held by the river's flow, moving through darkness towards some distant sea, part of a system vast and ancient and ongoing. Rest now on the river. Let the water carry you. Let the forest sounds envelope you. Tomorrow, there will be more journeys, more discoveries, more questions. But tonight, there is only the river and the night, the gentle movement of current and the patient presence of the forest. Sleep well and dream of green depths and brown waters, of journeys upstream and knowledge slowly gained, of a place that has been home for some and destination for others, but that exists primarily as itself. A river flowing through forest, a forest sustained by river, an ecosystem of endless complexity and profound connection. The Amazon flows on through darkness toward dawn, carrying its waters toward the sea, its channels branching and rejoining in patterns too complex to fully map, its processes continuing as they have for millennia. And in that continuity, in that patient ongoing existence, there is something deeply restful. The reminder that we are part of systems larger and longer than ourselves, that rivers flow whether we watch them or not, that forests grow in rhythms of seasons and years and centuries. Rest in that knowledge, rest in the flow, rest as the river rests, not by stopping, but by continuing its eternal movement toward the ocean. The nighttime Amazon reveals itself differently than the daytime forest. During day, the overwhelming impression is of green, every shade from almost yellow new leaves to deep black green of old canopy foliage. But at night, color disappears, replaced by shades of gray and black, punctuated by points of light. These lights tell their own stories. Bioluminescent fungi glow on rotting logs, pale green or blue-white, marking decomposition's slow work. Click beetles carry luminescent spots on their thorax, flashing signals as they fly. In flooded forests during high water, bioluminescent bacteria sometimes bloom in the still backwaters, creating ghostly glows when disturbed. The sounds of night are richer than day in some respects. Many forest animals are nocturnal or crepuscular, active in evening and early morning hours. Frogs emerge from hiding spots to call, each species with its own voice. Chirps, whistles, trills, clucks, screams. A stream or pond edge might host dozens of calling males, creating a wall of sound. Naturalists trying to identify species by call spent hours learning to separate individual voices from the chorus to match sounds to the frogs that made them. Some calls were easy to localize, others seemed to come from everywhere. Acoustic tricks that protected calling males from predators that hunted by sound. Insects added layers to the soundscape. Cicadas began calling at dusk, rasping choruses that gradually faded as darkness deepened. Katydids took over, their varied calls mimicking birdsong, ratting chains or buzzing alarms. Mosquitoes whined near ears, a sound everyone who spent time in the Amazon learned to hate. Beetles bumbled heavily through the air, sometimes crashing into faces or lamps, their hard wing cases clattering. Moths' silent flight was detectable only when they landed, their wings creating faint rustling. Larger animals contributed their own sounds. Howler monkeys, despite their name, were often most vocal at dawn and dusk, their roaring calls carrying for kilometers through forest. The sound is startling to those who hear it for the first time, deeper and louder than seems possible from a primate, more like a jaguar or a big cat. The howlers use these calls to space themselves, to avoid encounters with other troops, to proclaim territory. At night, they usually fell silent, sleeping in tree crowns. Nightjars and potus called from perches, their eerie cries sometimes sounding almost human. Owls hooted, each species with its own pattern. Repeated single notes, ascending scales, descending tremolos. Parrots settling into roosts created bursts of screeching activity, quarrels over preferred perches or mates continuing into early darkness before the flock finally quieted. Alone or in pairs, parrots were fairly quiet, but in flocks they were raucous, and the contrast between their noisy evenings and silent nights was marked. Water sounds provided constant background. River current gurgled and hissed, changing pitch where obstacles channeled flow or where depth varied. Waves lapped shores with rhythms dependent on wind and current. Fish jumped with splashes, some species doing so regularly, others only occasionally. River dolphins surfaced with exhalations that could be heard across calm water, their breaths louder than one might expect. Caimans moved almost silently except when catching prey, the sudden thrash and splash of a successful strike audible from distance. Rain transformed the soundscape completely. Tropical rain began suddenly, often with little warning. A change in wind, a darkening of clouds, and then drops starting to fall. Within moments, gentle patter escalated to pounding roar as true downpour arrived. Rain on water created white noise, masking other sounds. Rain on forest canopy produced different tones as it hit leaves, filtered through branches, finally reached the ground in streams and drips. After rain passed, dripping continued for hours, and the forest seemed to exhale moisture, humidity nearly visible in the heavy air. Thunderstorms were frequent, particularly during afternoon and evening. Lightning illuminated the forest in stark, brilliant flashes, turning night into day for instants. Thunder rumbled and crashed, echoing across distances. The combination of lightning, thunder, rain, and wind could be frightening even to experienced travelers. The raw power of tropical weather, the knowledge that trees could fall, boats could capsize, camps could flood. Most severe storms passed in 30 minutes to an hour, though their aftermath, flooded trails, swollen streams, fallen branches, might persist for days. For travelers camping along rivers, night brought specific considerations. One was the river itself. Level could change overnight if heavy rain fell upstream, and a camp made on an evening beach might be underwater by morning if misjudged. Experienced boatmen checked the river's stage, looked for marks showing recent high water levels, and chose camping spots with margins of safety. Another consideration was wildlife. Snakes hunted at night, and while most avoided humans, stepping on one in darkness could be dangerous. Checking boots and gear before use became reflexive. Spiders, some quite large, were common at night, and while most were harmless, their sudden appearance near sleeping areas could startle. Jaguars were rare but always present in thought. Stories of jaguars circulated constantly. A jaguar seen crossing a river upstream, tracks found on a beach, sounds in the night that might be a jaguar. Actual encounters were unusual, as jaguars typically avoided humans. But the knowledge that these powerful predators existed in the forest added an edge to nighttime awareness, a reminder that humans were not the only large mammals using these spaces. Bats emerged at dusk in extraordinary numbers and diversity. The Amazon hosts hundreds of bat species, filling nocturnal niches from fruit eating to nectar feeding to insect catching to blood drinking. Some species roosted in hollow trees, emerging in groups. Others roosted beneath bridges or in buildings, if such structures existed. Fishing bats skimmed low over water, using echolocation to detect fish breaking the surface and catching them with long-clawed feet. Vampire bats, despite their reputation, were rarely problems for humans, preferring to feed on livestock where available or on wild mammals. The processing of nighttime observations became part of research routine. Mist nets checked at intervals caught birds and bats, which had to be identified, measured, marked with bands for long-term tracking studies, and released. Moth traps, light shining on white sheets, attracted extraordinary diversity, and hours could be spent sorting specimens, preserving some and photographing others for later identification. Frog calls recorded on audio equipment needed to be matched to species, sometimes requiring catching calling frogs to confirm identification. A task requiring stealth and often getting thoroughly wet and muddy. Night collecting revealed aspects of biodiversity invisible during day. Many insects emerged only after dark. Stick insects and leaf insects, so well camouflaged on foliage during day, moved at night to feed and could be spotted with headlamps. Certain butterflies, despite being considered day-flying insects, had crepuscular species active in deep shade at dusk. Scorpions and whip scorpions, nearly invisible during day, glowed under ultraviolet light, a phenomenon researchers use to census them. Entire groups of organisms, like certain moth families, were known primarily from night collecting. The cultural significance of night in Amazonian indigenous societies deserves more attention. Night was not merely the absence of day, but a distinct time with its own spirit presences, its own dangers and opportunities. Many ceremonial practices occurred at night: masked dances, singing, consumption of visionary plants, healing rituals. These practices often involve travel to specific locations, sacred spots in the forest, riverside clearings, places associated with particular ancestors or spirits. The songs and stories performed at night carried knowledge, information about history, about relationships between human and non-human beings, about proper conduct, and about dangers to avoid. Some stories explained features of landscape, why a river had a certain bend, what being was transformed into a particular rock formation, which animals were originally human, and why they changed form. These narratives were not fanciful, but were serious knowledge, encoding information about identity, about territory, about the past, and its continuing relevance to the present. Shamanic practice, central to many Amazonian cultures, often involved nighttime work. Shamans entered altered states through fasting, through consumption of tobacco or other plants, through rhythm and song, accessing knowledge and power that ordinary consciousness did not permit. In these states, shamans might diagnose illness, retrieve lost souls, negotiate with spirits, or influence weather and hunting success. The practice required years of training, learning songs and techniques from elder shamans, undergoing initiations that tested physical and spiritual resilience. The plants used in these practices, ayahuasca being perhaps the most widely known, required careful preparation and respectful use. Ayahuasca combined two plants, the vine Banisteriopsis kaapi, and usually leaves from Psychotria viridis, prepared by boiling to create a bitter brown liquid. Its consumption produced visions described as journeys to other realms where plant and animal spirits could be encountered, where knowledge could be gained, where healing could occur. The practice was and is not recreational but serious spiritual work, approached with fasting, intention, and guidance from experienced practitioners. External interest in ayahuasca and other Amazonian plant medicines has created complex dynamics. Some indigenous groups have welcomed opportunities to share their knowledge and to gain income from ceremonies conducted for outsiders. Others have been concerned about appropriation, about spiritual practices being commodified, about sacred knowledge being misunderstood or misused. These concerns reflect broader tensions about who has authority over indigenous knowledge and how that knowledge can be shared across cultural boundaries without exploitation or disrespect. The ethnobotanical knowledge encoded in Amazonian cultures represents centuries of experimentation and observation. Knowing which plants treat particular illnesses, how to prepare them, what dosages are effective and safe. This knowledge required time to develop and discipline to transmit. Western medicine has validated some traditional remedies, finding active compounds that work as indigenous knowledge said they would. Quinine from cinchona bark, now synthesized but originally extracted from Andean trees, whose use local peoples shared with Europeans. is perhaps the most famous example. Other compounds from Amazonian plants have entered pharmacopoeias or become subjects of research, but ethnobotanical knowledge is more than a database of useful plants. It is embedded in relationships between people and plants, between knowers and learners, between communities and territories. Plants are not just resources but relatives, beings with their own lives and preferences, requiring respect and care. Harvest practices include prayers or offerings, leaving some individuals unharvested to ensure reproduction, rotating gathering sites to prevent depletion. These practices reflect understanding that humans depend on plant communities and must maintain reciprocal relationships that sustain both. The night forest's ecology itself deserves attention. Many tree species flower at night, their blooms visited by night-active pollinators, bats and moths primarily, but also some beetles and flies. These flowers often have strong fragrances that help attract pollinators in darkness, and many are pale or white, more visible in low light than colored flowers would be. The coevolution between night-flowering plants and night pollinators has produced remarkable specializations. Bat-pollinated flowers with robust structures that can support clinging bats. Long-tubed flowers accessible only to hawk moths with correspondingly long proboscises, flowers that open only for a few hours each night, timing their bloom to coincide with pollinator activity peaks. Fruit bat species disperse seeds for many trees, consuming fruits and defecating seeds away from parent trees. Some of these relationships are highly specific, particular bat species preferring particular fruit types and particular trees depending on particular bat species for dispersal. Breaking these relationships through forest fragmentation or overhunting of bats has consequences for tree regeneration, demonstrating how interconnected forest components are. Night-hunting birds, owls, nightjars, potus, fill niches that diurnal raptors occupy during day. Their sensory adaptations for night are remarkable. Owls' asymmetric ear placement allows precise sound localization, letting them hunt in complete darkness by hearing prey movement. Their feather structure produces nearly silent flight, preventing prey from hearing approach. Large eyes gather maximum light, though contrary to popular belief, most owls hunt by sound at least as much as by sight. Nightjars and potus, with enormous mouths, catch flying insects in flight, opening mouths to scoop up prey like aerial nets. Nocturnal primates in the Amazon include night monkeys, the only truly nocturnal anthropoid primates in the world. Night monkeys have large eyes relative to body size, and they move cautiously through forest canopy, feeding on fruits and insects. Their social structure differs from day-active primates, typically forming monogamous pairs with offspring rather than larger troops. Their adaptations to night, enhanced vision, slow, careful movement, reliance on vocal communication, make them fascinating subjects for researchers studying primate evolution and adaptation. Riverfish also showed daily rhythms. Some species fed primarily at night, using barbels and electrical sense to locate prey in murky water. Catfish species, diverse and abundant in the Amazon, were largely nocturnal, resting in crevices or buried in substrate during day. Fishermen knew this, timing night fishing to target species like the large pirarucu that rose to surface to breathe at night. The sound of pirarucu breathing, an audible gasp as they inhaled air, allowed hunters to locate them in darkness. Electric fish, members of several families that produce electrical fields for communication and navigation, were particularly active at night. These fish could not be caught with light and nets like many others, but required different techniques. Some generated weak electric fields, using them to navigate and locate prey through electrolocation, a sense foreign to humans but crucial in murky waters. Others, like electric eels, produce strong shocks capable of stunning prey or deterring predators. Despite the name, electric eels are not true eels, but a type of knife fish, and they require access to air to breathe. The aquatic environment at night transformed in other ways too. Many fish larvae and invertebrates underwent daily vertical migrations, rising towards surface at night and descending during day. This behavior, seen in oceans as well, may protect small organisms from visual predators while allowing them to feed in warmer surface waters. The result was that nighttime plankton toes collected different species than daytime toes, and understanding aquatic communities required sampling at multiple times. Amphibians, particularly frogs, were defining features of Amazonian nights. The diversity of frog species in any given forest area could be astonishing. Dozens of species, sometimes over 100, each occupying slightly different microhabitats and using slightly different cooling sites and times. Tree holes, leaf litter, stream edges, pond margins, vegetation tangles, each had its frog specialists. Some species bred in temporary pools created by rain, racing to develop from egg to froglet before pools dried. Others bred in streams, their tadpoles adapted to flowing water. Still, others didn't lay eggs in water at all, but attached them to leaves above streams, the hatching tadpoles dropping into water below, or even carried eggs or tadpoles on their backs. The calling of male frogs served to attract females and to space out males, preventing too much competition for good calling sites. The calls had to be loud enough to carry through background noise, but not so energetically expensive that males exhausted themselves. Calls had to be distinctive enough that females of the right species could recognize them, but not so simple that other species imitated them. The result was an extraordinary array of calls, a biological soundscape that researchers were still working to fully catalogue. Reptiles at night included snakes, some of which hunted actively while others ambushed prey. Pit vipers, represented in the Amazon by species like the fer de lance, had heat-sensing pits that detected warm-blooded prey. These snakes could strike accurately even in complete darkness, targeting rodents or birds by their body heat. Constrictors like boa constrictors and anacondas also hunted at night, moving slowly through vegetation or along forest floor, relying on chemical cues and vibration to locate prey. Most snakes were not dangerous to humans, but the presence of venomous species meant that nighttime walks required caution, flashlights to see the path ahead, and awareness of where one placed hands and feet. Caimans, the Amazonian relatives of alligators, were most easily observed at night when their eyes reflected flashlight beams with brilliant red or orange eyeshine. Spotlighting for caimans became a common nighttime activity at research stations and tourist lodges, boats cruising slowly along river edges with powerful lights scanning for eye reflections. When eyes were spotted, boats approached carefully, allowing observers to identify species by size and head shape and to estimate population numbers based on density of sightings. The largest species, black caiman, could reach 5 meters and were formidable predators, though like most caimans, they typically avoided humans. The transition between day and night, dusk and dawn, were times of particular activity. In the tropics, with fairly constant daylight length throughout the year, sunrise and sunset occurred at regular times, and organisms could reliably time activities to these transitions. Birds that roosted in flocks created spectacular gatherings at dusk, thousands of individuals converging on traditional roost sites. Parrots, in particular, were known for this, their screeching flocks wheeling into favored trees as light faded. The social function of these roosts, information exchange about food locations, mate finding, predator avoidance, was still being studied. Dawn chorus, the intense burst of birdsong at sunrise, was one of the forest's most dramatic acoustic phenomena. Males of many species sang at first light, proclaiming territories and attracting mates. The chorus built gradually, individual species beginning at slightly different light levels, until at sunrise the forest erupted in song. For about an hour, the volume and diversity of singing were overwhelming. Then, as day brightened and temperatures rose, singing gradually declined as birds shifted to foraging. The dawn chorus's intensity reflected the importance of vocal territorial defense in dense forest, where visual displays were less effective. From a naturalist perspective, these transitions were prime times for observation and collecting. At dusk, diurnal species became less wary as they sought roost sites, and nocturnal species began emerging. Both could be observed in the same hour. At dawn, the reverse occurred. Nocturnal species hurrying to shelters as diurnal species became active. Mist nets set across forest trails or near fruiting trees caught birds during these movement periods, and the hour after dawn was often the most productive for bird banding operations. Insect emergences also timed to dawn or dusk. Mayflies, whose aquatic larvae lived in streams, emerged as adults in evening swarms, their brief adult lives devoted entirely to reproduction. The emerging swarms attracted birds and bats, creating feeding frenzies. Similarly, termite colonies sent out winged reproductive individuals during rain at dusk. Thousands or millions of winged termites emerging simultaneously from a colony to mate and found new colonies. The ground beneath the emergent site became littered with discarded wings as the termites shed them after their brief flight, and predators of all kinds converged to feed on this sudden abundance. The cultural production inspired by the Amazon, the paintings, writings, films, music, often focused on dramatic or exotic elements, but some works conveyed something deeper. Artists who spent time in the forest, who listened and observed patiently, created works that captured not just what the Amazon looked like, but how it felt, its atmosphere and rhythms. The Brazilian composer Heitor Villa-Lobos incorporated Amazonian themes and sounds into his music. Painters like Albert Eckhout in the 17th century, or the French artist Jean-Pierre Danton in the 19th, created detailed images of Amazonian life and nature. Filmmakers from indigenous communities increasingly documented their own perspectives, creating counter-narratives to external representations. Literature about the Amazon ranged from adventure tales that treated the forest as a backdrop for human drama, to more thoughtful works that tried to convey ecological complexity or indigenous worldviews. Some of the most powerful writing came from those who lived in the Amazon, rather than visiting it. Brazilian, Peruvian, Colombian, and other South American authors whose relationship to the forest was not that of outsiders discovering the exotic, but of residents articulating something of home's reality and meaning. Contemporary discussions about the Amazon's future often pit development against conservation, economic growth against environmental protection, as if these were necessarily opposed. Some argue that the Amazon should be preserved in its natural state, a position that ignores thousands of years of human habitation and the fact that much of what seems natural has been influenced by indigenous management. Others argue for development rights, claiming that Amazonian countries should be able to exploit their forests as industrialized nations exploited their own natural resources in the past. Neither extreme fully addresses the complexity. Many indigenous and traditional communities articulate third positions, that they can manage forests sustainably, that their continued presence actually protects forest better than top-down conservation schemes, that they have rights both to their territories and to participate in decisions about development that affect them. The data increasingly support these positions. Deforestation rates are generally lower within indigenous territories than in comparable areas outside them. Community-managed forests often maintain higher biodiversity and greater carbon storage than government-managed protected areas. These patterns suggest that recognizing indigenous and traditional rights is not just a matter of justice, but also of effective conservation. Yet threats continue. Illegal logging, mining, land invasion, and resource extraction persist despite laws and protected status. Violence against environmental and indigenous defenders is common in some regions, with community leaders, activists, and journalists murdered for opposing powerful economic interests. The legal frameworks protecting Amazon territories and forests are often weak or poorly enforced, and political changes can rapidly reverse protections. Climate change compounds these threats. Changing rainfall patterns could push parts of the Amazon toward tipping points where forest converts to savanna, a transformation that would be extremely difficult to reverse. Droughts are becoming more frequent and severe in some areas, stressing trees and increasing fire risk. Fire being historically rare in moist tropical forests, but increasingly common where forest is fragmented or degraded. The interactions between deforestation, climate change, and fire create feedback loops that accelerate forest loss. International attention to the Amazon waxes and wanes with news cycles, with dramatic events like massive fires drawing headlines, while slow processes like steady deforestation or mercury poisoning attract less notice. The Amazon becomes symbolic of environmental crisis, of wilderness under threat, of indigenous resistance, but symbols can obscure as much as they reveal. The Amazon is not a single thing, but an enormously complex region, varied in ecology and in human presence, facing multiple challenges that require context-specific responses rather than one-size-fits-all solutions. For those who have spent time in the Amazon, who have traveled its rivers and walked its forests, the region becomes personal. The abstraction of Amazon rainforest resolves into specific places. This village where a friend lives, that river where a memorable swim occurred, this trail where particular birds nest, that fig tree that produces fruit reliably each year, attracting dozens of bird species. The knowledge becomes embodied, held in muscle memory of paddling strokes and trail walking, in sensory memory of sounds and smells and textures. This personal knowledge complements but never replaces local knowledge. An outsider spending years in the Amazon still knows far less than someone who grew up there, who learned the forest from childhood, whose knowledge goes back generations. The humility this recognition requires, acknowledging that being an expert in one context doesn't make one an expert in all contexts, is essential for respectful engagement. The Amazon at night remains largely mysterious to most people, including most people who study it. The difficulty of nocturnal observation, the dangers real and imagined, the simple fact that humans are diurnal and less comfortable in darkness. All these mean that night forests receive less study than day forests, yet night is half of every day, and understanding ecology requires understanding what happens in darkness as much as in light. New technologies help. Infrared camera traps record animals that never appeared during human presence. Acoustic monitoring systems capture sound continuously, creating audio archives that can be analyzed for patterns. Night vision equipment allows observation without artificial light that changes behavior. But technology complements rather than replaces direct observation. The patient nighttime sitting and watching and listening that remains fundamental to knowing a place. As this story draws to a close, as dawn approaches in our imagined journey, consider what the night has offered. We have traveled upstream against the current, through darkness occasionally pierced by lightning or lantern light, listening to the forest's voices, feeling the river's power. We have encountered the Amazon not as a place of adventure or danger, though it can be both, but as a complex living system. Rivers and forests and the beings who inhabit them, including humans who have been present for millennia. The exploration of the Amazon continues, though its nature has shifted. No longer about mapping rivers or collecting species for the first time. Though new species are still regularly discovered, exploration now means understanding relationships, tracking changes, working towards sustainable futures. It means collaborating across cultural boundaries, respecting knowledge in all its forms, recognizing that rivers and forests have values beyond their economic utility. Rest now as dawn comes to the Amazon. The night sounds fade gradually, replaced by the growing chorus of dawn. The darkness lifts, revealing mist over the river, the forest canopy emerging from shadow. The journey continues, the river flows, the forest persists. And in its persistence, despite all challenges, there remains hope. Hope that this extraordinary place will endure, that its human and biological communities will adapt and thrive, that future generations will know rivers and forests in something approaching their fullness. If you're still awake, you'll shortly find another midnight exploration waiting on your screen, or you may choose a playlist to continue your journey through the night. If these stories have brought you peace, please consider liking, subscribing, or sharing your midnight reflections with us. Your support helps our community grow and allows us to reach other fellow explorers wishing to find their rest. Sleep well, traveler. The Amazon will still be there when you wake, its rivers flowing toward the sea, its forests growing and changing, its peoples continuing their lives in places that have been home for longer than history records. May your rest be deep, and may your dreams carry echoes of the river's voice and the forest's song.